we now know. And I think we went over that a little bit already in some of the warm-up, and I want to consciously first take a look at the art of all this. We're standing here on ground that was once called Manhattan. It was practically stolen from the indigenous tribes that live here. The wall on Wall Street was built to keep indigenous people out. On one end of Wall Street, there was a thriving slave market. So the fact that this is still the core of American capitalism is no coincidence, and it has a long history. And this spot is in a country where, along with European countries, built industrial empires on the backs of African slavery and stealing the resources from these lands. And then when they quote-unquote liberate those countries, expect them to get on equal footing quick, and when they don't, get subject to the WTO, the IMF, etc., etc., etc. So the idea of colonialism is not a distant idea. It's an idea that exists today. The idea of the 1% and the 99% is not an American idea. It is a global idea. We happen to be in the hemisphere where a lot of this stuff started brewing. I guess the project that I maybe want to complete in a couple minutes is thinking about the gap between what we learned and what we know about Columbus, and figuring out why is it important for people to paint him as a hero first before we figure out later. Why was it important to talk about him in an uncritical way? Why didn't the sort of quote-unquote revision of Columbus history start much earlier?
I asked questions that too, which is that even in the time span of children's lives that happens, so many of my students as young elementary schoolers learn that Columbus was a hero, and then in middle and high school learn the quote-unquote truth. And so I'm so curious about why as a society we continue that pattern as well as Brian has mentioned. We're afraid to tell our children the truth sometimes. It's like people continually telling our children Santa Claus is real to hold on to their innocence. And sometimes, even at such a young age, they need to be taught the truth so that there will not be closed-mindedness of what truth is. You know, oh, they're young. Yes, they're sponges now. And if we continue to have that they're young mentality, they're going to continue to grow up to be naive. And be part of the 1% and not the 99.
I think too, it comes down to what we would have to admit. If we did tell the truth about what happened in the beginning of the Spanish conquest, and since if we admitted, and we talked about the impact on Native Americans. I think that goes back to who we are as Americans as well. That's part of my identity, even though I'm also have an indigenous background, but I'm also an American. So what do I have to admit as a person and as part of my heritage happened? And what would that, why would I want to do that? And so would it be easier for me to paint Christopher Columbus as a hero? Would it be easier for me to tell that to my children so that we can celebrate our American heritage rather than having to admit to the truth of colonialism and that impact on other people?
Other comments? What's the political purpose of painting him as a hero and continuing that story for so long?
Well, I think the political purpose is a manifestation of manifest destiny. When you're saying that it's okay for Columbus to kill and colonize all these people, you're basically saying there is no way, there is no resistance. This is the way it was meant to be. And it happens through every narrative that we've gone through since then, since before then. If you make a history that's smooth transition, you never have a change. And so when you're not expected to change, then things have to stay the same because that's the way they were and that's the way they will always be, versus changing something that'll make it happen. Something, so those of us who have a voice know what to do. It's just all a matter of getting it done. And that's where it comes down to. Unfortunately, that narrative continues. So Christopher Columbus is that manifestation. He is the icon of that manifest destiny.
It's funny too because he never came up here. It's this myth that we have that he quote unquote even founded the United States, but that's, he didn't found anything
back what the mission was when he set sail from Europe?
Well, he was on a mission to find resource. He was interested in trade. And as we can look at the history of trade, many places in the world did not necessarily link that with violence. But when we read the primary source documents of what he and his sailors did when they arrived on Hispaniola and named it Hispaniola, they certainly did engage in violence, and they were looking for gold. And so I think that you're right to question what was the original purpose. The purpose was money and resources.
It's the 3 G's. It's gold, it's God, and it's glory. Right? And the idea is that, you know, Columbus also was a very deeply religious man. He had this sort of mysticism to himself, and he thought that he was being called by God to go out and, you know, discover this shorter route to China and get spices. And I think part of that starts to fall into the idea that, you know, all these, that glory and gold and God are things that we should all want, right? They wanted to find a labor force. They wanted to convert them to Christianity. They wanted to, you know, bring them into civilization once they found them there, the indigenous people. So I think those are the major motives.
And I think the thing to remember, Columbus didn't just make one trip.
Right.
He went back and forth 4 times, 5 times?
I think 4 times.
4 times.
Made the choice to continue what he started.
Exactly. So yeah, like there's one issue, he comes here and he decides profits are more important than the people's lives. But then knowing full well what was established here, he came back 3 times to keep it going.
And he was actually the governor of Hispaniola for a while, right? And the way that he treated the native people, you know, and all that barbarity was the same kind of barbarity that he also treated European workers with, who were there working in that colony. And, you know, he was dragged out, you know, in chains because he was so brutal to the people that were there. He got back to Spain and he was put on trial. You know, I think that's an important point to remember as well.
Remember, this is taking place during a time that Karl Marx called like the primitive accumulation of capital. So this was, whether or not, you know, the specific intent of murder of people in the Western Hemisphere was there from the start. This was clearly a project of what we might call now economic imperialism. And so the motives were certainly there for gain. And I think beyond that, for me, and maybe I'll close with this and we can move on to the sort of the nitty-gritty part of what Brian's going to do. For me, it's a question of progress. Zinn, in Zinn's first chapter is what I use a lot to introduce kids to the idea of Columbus. He makes a digression in the chapter about progress. And when we sanitize the history of Columbus, it's in a project to claim that there's this linear progress, that everything is getting better the whole time, and it's a story of the triumph of everything good moving forward, with no uncritical, you know, with no critical thought about stuff before it. And it also advances the idea of, you know, European ethnocentrism, right? That this was sort of a better conquering a worse, in almost a social Darwinistic sense. And so, when we get imbued with these thoughts, when it comes time to make decisions about whether or not to drop an atomic bomb on Asian people, we think that's the price we pay for progress. When it comes time to, even years before that, push tribes in the plains westward, round them up on reservations, erase their culture in schools like the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, it's the price we pay for progress. It's a better overcoming a worse. And when we start with Columbus that way, it's the start of that project, that story of history advancing. And so I think maybe to get a closer look at you know, why it's important to show kids what actually happened there, and also what level of culpability does Columbus have? After all, he was operating within a system of empire. Brian's going to do a little bit of stuff about more of the events on the ground.
And that's what we want to think about next, which is, you know,